Chapter 8 of Julia Ried. Julia Ried by Pansy. Chapter 8. In which I discover a Christian duty. "My impressions," said Mr. Tyndall, "are very vivid at least. What was the text, Fanny?" Mrs. Tyndall could not tell, and so long had it been gone from my mind that I could do no better; but the doctor being appealed to, repeated it slowly and solemnly. "What will ye? Shall I come unto you with a rod, or in love?" "Exactly," continued Mr. Tyndall. "Now, if Dr. Mulford had that matter in his own hands, I don't believe he would stop to inquire as to our choice in the matter. He would take the rod and make use of it right and left. The way he did give it to us, Sayles! You ought to have been there. You would have discovered that you had a conscience. That man would have made a good pugilist. I think it is as good as a play, the manner in which he tears around that pulpit. I wonder at your absenting yourself, Sayles. It answers the place of a theater to me." "Mr. Tyndall!" His wife's voice had a note of reproof in it, but she smothered a laugh as she spoke. Mr. Sayles looked triumphant. "There," he said, "we have positive proof of your devotional feelings. Now, I'll leave it to the doctor if I didn't, evidently, get more good out of my morning than that." The doctor's voice was dignified, even to hauteur, as he answered: "I presume, Mr. Sayles, neither building is responsible for the spirit in which a man enters it." "But other things being equal, you would say that in an orthodox church a man might expect to receive good?" "I repeat that I think that must depend very largely on the spirit of the man." "Miss Ried," said Mr. Tyndall, abruptly, "what was the matter with your spirit and mine this morning? I observed that yours impressed your risibles in a way in which I would have been delighted to join." "Hush!" Mrs. Tyndall said, gently, while I colored to the very roots of my hair. "That was not the poor child's fault in the least. People can not surely be surprised that Dr. Mulford's peculiar facial infirmity excites laughter when one sees it for the first time. I have been for 3 years endeavoring to become accustomed to it, and I am far from being perfected in my endeavor." The doctor fixed a pair of very sharp eyes on Mrs. Tyndall as he asked: "To what infirmity do you refer, may I ask? I have never observed any." The lady first opened her blue eyes very wide, in token of her astonishment, then drew her face into such a ridiculous exaggeration of Dr. Mulford's that her husband and guest roared with laughter. The doctor's answer was dignified, haughty, utter silence; and almost immediately he excused himself and left the room. "Is Dr. Douglass' digestion good?" queried Mr. Sayles, with a grave face. Mrs. Tyndall responded, laughingly: "I really can't say. Why?" "Because, if it isn't, I feel conscience stricken. Such a solemn state as that into which we have put him is said to interfere sadly with dyspeptics." Mr. Tyndall had regained his gravity, and spoke more thoughtfully than I had yet heard him. "I am afraid we have wounded his feelings. He has a sort of a worshipful feeling for Dr. Mulford, I think." Mr. Sayles glanced up quickly. "Do you think so?" he asked, with an air of real regret. "I should be very sorry. I intended not the slightest disrespect to Dr. Mulford. He is a gentleman, I think. But, Mrs. Tyndall, your face was too ridiculous." Whereupon he laughed again. Mrs. Tyndall answered him, composedly: "Finish your cream, Mr. Sayles. I'll answer for Dr. Douglass' feelings. He is not so foolish a man as Mr. Tyndall would have you suppose. He knows, as do all the rest of you, that I have unbounded respect and a high regard for Dr. Mulford. But that does not alter the fact that he certainly has a very queer mouth." The talk flowed on into other channels. About the singing, Mrs. Tyndall asserted that the alto was too heavy, and her husband as earnestly affirming that it was grand. Mrs. Tyndall seemed to differ, in a graceful, ladylike way, with everybody, on every subject. After we returned to the parlor, I gave myself up to uncomfortable thought. The closing of the outer door, and the brisk tread of Dr. Douglass as he made his way, alone, to the mission school, did not serve to make my self-communings any pleasanter. I realized that thus far the day had been an unprofitable one. I had faint thoughts of going to my room and endeavoring to atone for my unfortunate beginning. But the parlor was the very perfection of comfort, and the murmur of tongues seemed to soothe the homesick spirit that was in my heart. When I gave attention to them again, Mr. Sayles had returned to the subject which had been under discussion at the dinner table. I am really very sorry for the turn that our conversation took, and am very much afraid that we hurt the doctor's feelings. I am sure I don't know what would have tempted me to do so. I wonder if it would do to offer an apology?" "Fanny is the one to apologize, I think, if there is anything of that sort to be done. She shouldn't have been so absurd." And Mr. Tyndall laughed again at the remembrance, a laugh in which his wife and Mr. Sayles joined. But the latter said, immediately: "I have heard that he is a great admirer and devoted friend of Dr. Mulford, and he must have thought our fun rather severe. Upon my word, I wouldn't have hurt the poor fellow's feelings for the world." "What a sensitive man you are," Mrs. Tyndall said, a touch of admiration in her voice. "I wish I were as thoughtful of other persons' feelings. I am so given to speaking my mind, without regard to the wisdom of such a proceeding." "I wish I were as thoughtful before I committed the blunder instead of afterward," laughed Mr. Sayles. "I never discovered that my afterthoughts did any particular good." "But in this instance I am sure your regrets are uncalled for. I feel certain that Dr. Douglass is too sensible a man to take offense at a little harmless talk between ourselves. Of course none of us intend to repeat it. To be sure, the doctor's abrupt departure looks as though his temper wasn't under as good subjection as usual, but his brisk walk in the fresh air will tone him down, and he will see the folly of his ill nature. So, Jerome, don't trouble your head about that for another minute. You have troubles enough of your own, I am sure. I am not going to let you find anything but pleasure in my house." And Mrs. Tyndall dismissed the doctor's supposed ill humor with a little laugh, and gracefully changed the conversation. I looked at Mr. Sayles as he lounged in the easy chair, his handsome head bobbing restlessly from corner to corner of the elegant tidy, and I wondered what the peculiar trials to which I had heard reference could be. He looked like a man whom trials had never touched. The conversation became animated presently, still about ministers. I noticed, many times since that day, that there are people who think they are having a religious conversation if they talk about clergymen. Dr. Whately was the name of the reverend gentleman who was being discussed. "He is really the finest orator in Newton," Mr. Tyndall said. "There is no one here who can compete with him." "Oh," said Mrs. Tyndall, "I shouldn't think there was. Why, I haven't heard a man in New York City who can surpass him. It is really a perfect feast to hear him preach. Miss Ried, his voice is melody itself, and I have seen many in his audience melted to tears, just by his manner in reading a hymn." "What about his logic, Mrs. Tyndall?" Mr. Sayles asked, with a mischievous twinkle in his eyes. "Oh, you know he doesn't force his peculiar views on people. I have heard him often, when I couldn't have determined, from the sermon, what his religious standpoint was." Both the gentlemen laughed, and Mr. Tyndall said: "That is rather hard on him, isn't it, Fanny? When a man has been called to preach for a church, who fully agree with him in his religious views, why shouldn't they have the pleasure of hearing those views presented?" "Oh, you may laugh," said Mrs. Tyndall, emphatically, "but I assure you that is an old-fashioned notion that doesn't obtain among first-class people, the idea that a man must be forever forcing some religious dogma upon his congregation." "For my part I like it," Mr. Sayles said, sturdily. "I always like to see a man act as though he wasn't ashamed of his belief, and thought it a matter of sufficient importance to feel the need of impressing it upon other people." At this point I chimed in. "So do I said, and while I spoke I thought to myself that I liked Mr. Sayles much better than I thought I should. I like Dr. Mulford for that very reason. He seems in earnest, and preaches as though he wanted other people to be." Mr. Tyndall's tones were complacence itself. "This just accords with my view of things," he said. "You good people find the storming of your own consciences a very troublesome business, and are happy to delegate it to your clergyman. As for Fanny here, it is getting to be an old story with her, and she begins to think it is an unnecessary proceeding altogether." Mrs. Tyndall laughed her sweet, good-natured, silvery laugh, and added: "As for Mr. Tyndall, he never had any conscience to speak of, so his idiosyncrasies can not be accounted for in that way. But I know a delightful way in which to end the discussion. Let us take Miss Ried to hear Dr. Whately this evening, and she will consider herself conquered at once." "Will she be taken?" queried Mr. Sayles, turning promptly to me, and then followed another discussion. I demurred, faintly enough, it is true, but the others were all clamorous for the plan, and my weak scruples were speedily overruled. Mr. Tyndall suppressed a yawn as he spoke. "That matter being settled, Sayles, which do you prefer in the meantime? A walk and a smoke with me, or a chat with the ladies?" Mr. Sayles had the grace to choose the walk and smoke, and I fully intended to go at once to my room, but, as the door closed after them, Mrs. Tyndall turned quickly toward me, and spoke eagerly. "Now, isn't it sad, Miss Ried, that of these two gentlemen, Dr. Douglass and Mr. Sayles, the one who makes no pretension to religion should be the one to show such a considerate spirit, and that so good a man as Dr. Douglass should give himself up to a burst of ill temper? I was so sorry that he rushed off in the manner that he did this afternoon. I knew that Mr. Sayles' sensitive nature would feel it, and the poor fellow has trouble enough of his own. Besides, how can Mr. Tyndall help drawing unfavorable contrasts? I do wish people could realize what an amount of harm they can do by these foolish bursts of passion." I remained silent and thoughtful. When the doctor left the dinner table, I had discovered nothing in his manner but grave and courteous dignity. That he felt hurt, I who knew him so well could but believe; but I had even admired the self-controlled face, showing his disapprobation only by its pallor. But viewed by the light of the afternoon's conversation, his manner began to appear decidedly objectionable, and Mr. Sayles' kind-hearted anxiety, lest he had offended, contrasted admirably. "Yes," I said at last, speaking slowly, "I am sorry that the doctor was so sensitive. It isn't like him." So absurd in him to grow angry because we laughed at the good old doctor's queer faces, as if anybody could help that! My dear, our good Dr. Douglass tries me occasionally in regard to his Puritan ideas. I verily believe he thinks it wicked for Mr. Sayles to come here on the Sabbath. He doesn't like poor Jerome anyway, and always treats him with severe gravity. But he adds a tenfold quantity if it happens to be Sunday. Now, shouldn't you suppose he could see that I make it a matter of duty to welcome Mr. Tyndall's friends most heartily at all times, and that I try especially to make the Sabbath a bright, happy day to him in his own home? I banish, or try to, all long faces, all sanctimonious airs. I particularly wish to relieve Mr. Tyndall from any of those "I am holier than thou" airs. They are always so extremely obnoxious to gentlemen. Isn't it strange that Dr. Douglass doesn't think of any of these little things? And yet I don't know as it is," with a little sigh and a peculiar sweet drooping of her shapely head. "I suppose he has always lived in a religious atmosphere. Probably all his friends are Christians, and he doubtless knows nothing about the perpetual anxieties and plannings of one who has so peculiar a nature as my husband's to deal with. I do hope you will help me, Miss Ried. I have needed help." I was silent and bewildered. I had been compromising with my conscience during that entire afternoon. I had disapproved of Mr. Sayles' Sunday visit, and of the style of conversation. I had felt grieved that Mr. Tyndall should be brought under such influence, having heard from Mrs. Tyndall how peculiar he was. I had considered the whole affair peculiarly demoralizing to him. I had been grieved and shocked over Mrs. Tyndall's own frivolous words. Now, was it possible there were two sides to this question? Were the doctor's and my own dear mother's ideas on these subjects narrow and puritanic, the result of a straitened system of education? Was Mrs. Tyndall conscientious in this matter, and had she taken the right course? Ah me! It is but little consolation to me tonight that I was sincere in my bewilderments. What right had I, with a Christian mother, and a father and sister in heaven, and a full knowledge of that old solemn command, "Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy," to be bewildered at all? But I was, and it is easy to-day to see how it all came to pass. Satan desired to have me, and I seemed only too willing to yield myself to his guidance, and began and lived through that Sabbath day without a word to that One stronger than Satan, to the end that he would keep me. What wonder that he stood aside and let that most skillful of all weavers tangle me in his silky looking web? Mrs. Tyndall broke the silence suddenly, with a total change of subject. "My dear, why don't you wave your hair and arrange it low on your forehead? It would be very becoming." "I don't know," I said hesitatingly, a little startled by the sudden transition. "I wish you would let me arrange it for you," she answered me with enthusiasm. "It is such lovely hair, I am sure I could do just what I wanted with it. Do you know you have a very artistic head. and I am a skillful artist in the matter of hair, I assure you. Won't you just come to my room and let me show you what I can do in that line? It will take but a very few moments, and would be such an improvement. I quite long to get my fingers in your beautiful hair. It will relieve your head too. I think you said it ached." It did ache, and as I sat in her low crimson chair in her dressing room, I told myself that that was the reason why I let Mrs. Tyndall pull and twitch and unmercifully snarl my hair on that Sabbath afternoon. The ringing of the church bells before the operation was concluded recalled me to a sense of Sabbath, and I suddenly wondered if this hair dressing could, by Mrs. Tyndall, be made to seem the right and proper thing to do. In a somewhat blundering fashion I asked her, and she answered: "There, I have finished. It is perfectly lovely. My dear, won't you please wear a blue velvet knot in your hair tonight? The effect would be so exquisite." Then, bending over, she kissed me gently, caressingly, and added: "My dear little conscientious mouse, don't you know that it is a Christian duty to make ourselves just as pretty as we can?" And I went to my room and knelt down before my trunk, and tumbled it upside down in search of a knot of blue velvet ribbon to wear in my hair. Chapter IX.